back to another episode of Fantastic Descriptions, a YouTube channel that explores the fine art of narrative description as it takes place in the role-playing game. I'm Neil Aiken. I'm an author, a translator, an editor, a creative writing coach, and a big fan of role-playing games. I've played them and run them for many, many years, since the original Red Box all the way through to 5th edition for Dungeons & Dragons, and dipping my toe occasionally into other gaming systems. What's common across them all is the need for us as game masters and dungeon masters to be able to spin a world out of language. We're aided often with miniatures and maps and terrain pieces. All these things are a wonderful addition to the game, but at its heart, it's still about telling a story and about creating a scene in the minds of those at the table or who are separated from us by technology, but nonetheless can hear us and see us. So how do we do that? Well, today's episode, we're going to look at describing people. And this seems like such a basic thing. The interesting thing for me is as I sat down preparing for this particular episode, I thought a lot about like what type of resources or what kind of chapters I'd read in the past that go into detail about describing character. And I was struck by how many of them fixate on developing character within a story, within a fictional piece, thinking about character as sort of an outgrowth of sort of internal motivations, thinking about them within a plot. But no one really sat down and talked about sort of just the nuts and bolts of the actual experience of seeing someone for the first time and thinking about the order in which we process that encounter. This brings us more in line with a type of critical study associated with phenomenology, which is thinking about experiences and sensory experience and encounters like this. But even still, I've not seen very much that has actually broken this down, and basically no one talks about this within the role-playing game community. So I took some notes and I kind of assembled a bit of a framework in which we can look at what's happening and how we can improve those descriptions of those first encounters. Because ultimately what we want is we want our players to remember these characters, especially if we're introducing a villain or an important NPC. We want our players to be able to grab a hold of them and imagine them in their minds. And we want ourselves to be able to have the same sort of familiarity with them, that we can turn back to these characters, these NPCs, and know them, and have some sort of a shorthand for them. So I'll begin with, I think my first bit of advice is to think about every character we introduce, every person we introduce into the scene, for the very first time that our players are encountering them. We need to think about what is the most dominant feature or trait that's going to pop out. So if we were to just shorthand this character, what's the thing that's going to pop out the most? So descriptions are built around a central feature or trait. All the descriptions that we provide, all the details of these descriptions usually support or serve to contrast or comment on whatever that central trait or feature might be. So if someone is disfigured or short or is burned in some particular way, that might be the dominant thing that overrides all other descriptions. And so something that is remarkable and unusual, something that is overwhelming everything else, might be the strongest feature. And sometimes that's something that isn't even visual. The example that comes to mind would be smell, scent. So if you encounter a character who, for the first time, who works in a sewer or, has just survived some horrific accident, magical accident, is covered in something that reeks, that's foul, then even before you can process the physical description of that character, your PCs are going to encounter, your player characters are going to encounter the smell. And the smell will be the first thing. Now, there may be other things that come to mind as like this character has been through something or is associated with something that maybe there's an aura of evil that's even more recognizable than the figure itself. We first process this sense of evil or cold or whatever it is, that is so wide, so big, so broad, that it emanates beyond sort of the visual sphere, and that's what we encounter first. So think about what transcends the visual, something that is overwhelming, and that will be the first thing that the person that you're describing is going to project outwards. The second thing, and I've studied a lot of this, looked at a lot of different accounts about this, and by and large, people gravitate towards eyes. People notice eyes first. So after smell or whatever the aura is, then we get to sort of the face and specifically the eyes. So we notice color, especially unusual color, intensity of gaze. We notice emotion that might be conveyed through the eyes. And we also will pay attention to whether or not that set of eyes recognizes us or is processing us or evaluating us in some way. So the idea of being seen is also important. When we see the eyes, we also are gazed upon. The look is turned back to us, and that recognition, that tension, is part of the connection that we make with that figure, that person that we're observing. The third would be the facial expression. So we often, when we look at someone, we're also going to think about the next thing. So if we go from aura to eyes to the face and the facial expressions, we'll recognize whether that person seems happy or seems angry or seems afraid or seems in some way to be projecting an emotion outward into the world. That facial expression may also convey, through the mouth or the brow, some sense of age. Or we might also pick up, we might process as we evaluate that face, its attractiveness. We will probably also pick out if it is of a different race than the observer. And here's something to think about as well, which is these descriptions are filtered, just like places and just like other things, filtered through the lens of the psychological state and the emotional state of the observer. So when you as a DM or a GM are describing what they see, you're also paying attention to what they think they see or what they anticipate seeing. So if you have a group of adventurers who are hunting for, let's say, some sort of nefarious halfling thief, and you track down a group of halflings in an area, your description might fixate on aspects that seem suspicious. And you can play up on that. Play up on the characters' own suspicions and how they might project outward into how they process and understand the expressions and the look, the appearance of these other people that they're seeing. Other things that we will process. Fourth thing is the stance. How does that character, how does that figure, that person stand? What is their posture? What is their positioning? How do they position themselves in reaction to observing your characters? Do they change their position? Do they rise from their chair? Do they suddenly duck behind something? But all these things suggest like they have recognized that they have been observed, and then they react accordingly. And all that motion is part of the change of position, is also something that we're thinking about as we process and view that person. And then it's also like that posture can also say a lot about how that person views themselves in relation to the observers, to the player characters. Does that person take a more defiant stance? Do they rest their hand upon their hilt of their sword as if not certain whether or not the party is about to launch into an attack? Do they hesitantly raise a hand as if to hold them back or to gesture them forward? And these type of things can help inform the players and the player characters how to process that person. So we pay attention to the stance, the posture, and the positioning of that person. The fifth thing that usually we notice are hands, or basically appendages, extremities. And so when we process them, we see the aura, the eyes, we move outward to the facial expression, to their figure, and their positioning, and then we might notice what's in their hands. We might realize, oh, he's brandishing a sword, or he has like a flaming, sphere of, some sort of alchemical agent is in his hand, or he's holding, a book. But these type of things we notice as we move outward and begin. So we begin, oddly enough, with the broadest, which is the aura around them, and then we go to the eyes, and we're moving gradually outward until we get to the hands, possibly to the feet, but to the hands. Hands also tell us a lot about mannerisms. We can see in those gestures, we can see like if there's a repetition, is there some sort of a physical tic or mannerism that is suggestive of nervousness, or suggestive of some sort of dismissiveness, whatever it is, some inattention or maybe addiction, something in the hands can help elaborate on that. Or it might simply be that they gesture with their hands in a grand way or in a hesitant way. But hands are another detail. So all this usually is what we're processing in that very, very first instant of observing a person. The next thing that we do is there are some secondary features that pop out. We might start paying attention as soon as we recognize the figure and we start to evaluate whether or not they're a threat or they're friendly. We start to also think about, how are they dressed? Do they dress in a way that matches our expectations? So we recognize them as Dragonborn, but then they're wearing robes. And so maybe they're not military at all. Maybe they're not soldiers. Maybe they're a caster that's a Dragonborn. So we can evaluate that way. We might also discover, as we look at their clothes, grooming habits. We might notice whether they're well kept or unkempt, or they're disheveled in some way. We can see evidence of wealth and class and status. We can see evidence of vanity, and we can see evidence of affiliation. So are they part of a group and they market themselves in that way? Badge or colors or signs, an amulet, a holy symbol, whatever it is. Sort of the device on their shield, whatever it is communicating something about affiliation. So their dress, their attire, their clothing, their armor, all these things are communicating important information, and that's what we'll arrive at and process next. But this is when we're making a conscious evaluation of the person, as opposed to the unconscious features which we are processing almost instantaneously. So as we're making sense of the person, we're paying attention to what they're wearing. Then we start to notice asymmetry. We start to notice, is there an absence or a difference between left and right? Between, like, maybe they have different colored eyes. Maybe they're missing an eye. Maybe they have, instead of regular hands, they have snakes for hands. Maybe they have a severed leg, and so they have a peg leg of some sort. We might notice that their face is not symmetrical. The eyes are different heights, or the mouth is crooked in some way. These type of things, this type of asymmetry, we start to notice because we're beginning sort of a deeper processing of how they fit in. Do they make sense? And as we're starting to remember who they are, or imagine or try to put it into our memory, we're thinking about it in terms of like places that are atypical, places that are asymmetrical. So the third thing we start to process or recognize is places that are aberrant, aberrations, abnormalities, strange and unusual features. So like if they have a tattoo, and the tattoos of an anchor, or tattoos of a dragon or butterfly, whatever it is, a scar, some sort of unusual growth, mole, wounds, these type of things we will pay attention to, and we'll start to evaluate and see if we can make sense of. And so these are sort of the secondary or the conscious level processing of describing a person. So having moved from unconscious unconscious impression to conscious evaluation, we now get into a set of things that we might also be paying attention to as we make descriptions, describing people to others. We are, as I alluded to earlier, we're often filtering description through the observer's psychological and emotional state. So if you are in danger and hunted, you're being pursued, then you are processing things in terms of threat. You're looking at people as potential threats or potential allies. And that type of binary is going to be a part of our processing. If you come from a place of fear, that's also going to be a factor. Whereas if you come out of, let's say there's some transcendent, heroic experience, and you step out and the first person you see, you're probably going to have a more benevolent, kind view on, because you've just had this great experience. So if you've just emerged victorious from something, you might be more inclined to see someone else as being an ally, or see someone else as needing your assistance because you've just been able to provide some sort of heroic service. So the observer's psychological or emotional state is part of that description, or at least how it filters that description. The second is context. We are thinking in terms of physical and situational context. So when you describe a person, you're not describing just the person. You're describing the person in the context of something. So that might be, you're describing, this goes back to talking about places, right? So if you're describing this person in the context of a library or in the context of a battle scene, this is the sole survivor. You see a body stir and rise up and realize that the old grandmother is the sole survivor of this massive, invasion that swept over the land and burned down all of her family and her kin, and that she's the last one there. So she stands up, and there's again more of this conscious processing and making sense of this context. When we see that person in that context, we now are starting to imagine a narrative in which they fit into, and a value system. Okay, so the physical and situational context. The third thing might be urgency. So like if your characters are in a rush, then they're fleeing something, right? So then you don't have time to give a detailed description. They're not thinking in terms of conscious level evaluation. They're simply thinking of immediate threat assessment, and does this person that they encounter strike them as friendly or not? Do they strike them as a potential ally, someone that they could use? And so you might just pick out a few of the initial dominant features, a few of those unconscious impressions, play to that, and then unless they decide to press it further, that's all they get. They may not stop and recognize that person was actually an elf. Maybe they miss little racial markers like that. Maybe they miss the fact that person's wounded, unless that's like the dominant, overwhelming thing is that they're gushing blood everywhere, whatever. But urgency can impact sort of the quality and the depth of the description that a person deserves or gets from us. And the fourth thing would be the observer's desires and needs. So again, sort of like when you come to a situation, the player characters rush into a situation. If they're looking for something, if they're looking for something or running from something, then everything gets evaluated within that. So let's say they're looking for, maybe they're aware that there are cultists hiding within this place, and they come across someone, the first thing they're going to process is whether or not this person looks like a cultist. And so all the description will be filtered through that lens of, is this person a cultist or not a cultist? Is this person an ally or not an ally? Is this person undead or not undead? So those type of things. If you are desperately in need of healing, and the party is wounded, looking for help, then they're going to be immediately processing and thinking about your descriptions will reflect whether or not they sense this person is a source of healing or assistance. Or is perhaps just as wounded as them, or worse. So those type of things are part of that processing, thinking about the encounter, the person. Okay, so that's kind of a rather quick overview, a fire hose approach to thinking about how we describe people and what are some of the factors or considerations as we set out to do so. How much information do we actually need to deliver, and why are certain types of details more compelling and interesting to players in one moment versus another moment? And a lot of this is just really thinking about, you want to play off of where they are psychologically and emotionally in this moment, then these are the type of things we focus on. So think about what's unconscious and overwhelming in terms of impression, and then think about, do they get the next level of more conscious evaluation, and to what degree do I need to engage like their psychological state, or I need them to understand the emotional, the physical, the situational context in which this is happening. Or is it a case of pacing and urgency that you just dispense with a lot of that and you just go straight to a very short canned description and move on? Hopefully that was useful, and I will be back again, hopefully more frequently than I've been for the last couple months, with another video that goes into another deep dive. Perhaps we'll do a little bit more on villains. I know some people have asked about that, so we'll talk about villains and how to create like a compelling entrance for a villain. And we might do a little bit about different types of big threat monsters and how to play up some of those aspects. If you've enjoyed this video, please give this video a thumbs up. Please subscribe to the channel and check back often. I hopefully will be arriving a little bit more regular schedule. I'm working on that. If you have suggestions or recommendations for other topics you would like me to address, I'd be happy to do so. And if you found other resources that have been helpful to you, articles or books, please recommend them. Where possible, I hope to start doing some reviews and talking about some of the resources that are out there, and kind of evaluate as well modules and other things that do engage in description, and think about what's working with them and what could be improved upon. And finally, if you yourself are the author of something that you would like me to evaluate and talk about, I'd be happy to do so. Just reach out and let me know. Contact information through the website or through YouTube. So until next time, take care, be safe, be well, and keep rolling dice. And we'll be back again soon.